Hollywood taught you that gunfights in the Old West were about speed. Two men, Main Street, high noon. The faster draw wins. Clean, honorable, over in seconds. That is a complete fabrication. Real shootouts in the American frontier were not duels. They were ambushes. They were massacres at close range. They were men shooting each other in the back, in the dark, through windows, from behind doors. Most men who died in gunfights never saw it coming, and the ones who survived didn't walk away like heroes. They bled out slowly, screaming, begging for water, dying from infections days later because there was no doctor within 100 miles. The mythology you grew up with was invented by dime novels in the 1880s and perfected by Hollywood in the 1950s. But the men who actually lived through the violence of the frontier left behind court records, autopsy reports, and newspaper accounts that tell a very different story. A story that was deliberately buried because it was too ugly, too random, and too honest about what violence actually does to the human body. This is what really happened when men shot each other in the Old West, and it's nothing like what you've been told. Between 1850 and 1890, the Western frontier was the most violent region in American history. But the violence wasn't structured. It wasn't ritualized. There were no rules. The so-called Code of the West that Hollywood romanticized didn't exist in any meaningful way. What did exist was this: poor men, armed men, drunk men, desperate men, all crammed into mining camps, cattle towns, and railroad settlements with no law enforcement, no courts that functioned, and no consequences that mattered. Murder rates in places like Body, California, and Dodge City, Kansas were 40 times higher than they are in modern American cities. But those murders didn't happen in the street at noon. They happened in saloons, in alleys, in boarding houses, in brothels. The firearms these men carried were not the polished Colt peacemakers you see in movies. Most carried old cap-and-ball revolvers, shotguns with barrels sawed off, or cheap cartridge pistols that misfired half the time. Accuracy was almost impossible. Even at 10 feet, most men missed. So they didn't aim carefully. They fired as many rounds as they could, as fast as they could, and hoped something hit. And when something did hit, the bullet didn't kill instantly. A .44 caliber ball to the stomach meant you were going to die, but it might take you 3 days. A shot to the lung meant you drowned in your own blood over the course of hours. A bullet to the leg could sever an artery, and you'd bleed out in minutes while everyone around you watched, helpless. Hollywood made gunfights look quick because quick is dramatic. But real death in the Old West was slow, agonizing, and soaked in panic. One of the most dangerous misconceptions about Old West violence is the idea that gunfighters faced each other. They didn't. The men who survived. Shootouts weren't the ones who were faster. They were the ones who shot first from ambush without warning. Wild Bill Hickok, one of the most famous gunfighters in history, was shot in the back of the head while playing cards. He never drew his weapon. Jesse James was shot in the back by a man he trusted. Billy the Kid was killed in the dark by Pat Garrett, who fired before Billy even knew someone was in the room. This wasn't cowardice. This was survival. Because the single biggest mistake a man could make in the Old West was believing that a gunfight would be fair. In 1881, a man named Luke Short got into an argument in a saloon in Tombstone. The other man stepped outside and waited. Short walked out the door thinking the confrontation was over. He was shot twice in the chest at point-blank range before he could react. He didn't die immediately. He stumbled back into the saloon, tried to speak, vomited blood, and collapsed. It took him 11 minutes to die. Witnesses said he was trying to say something the entire time, but no one could understand him. That was the reality. There was no countdown, no space between men, no honor, just violence delivered without warning to men who thought they were ready but never were. And even when men did try to face each other, the results were chaos. In 1876, 2 men in a Montana mining camp agreed to settle a dispute with pistols. They stood 15 feet apart. Both fired 6 rounds. Not a single bullet hit either man. But 2 bystanders were wounded, 1 fatally. The 2 men who started the fight both survived, reloaded, and kept shooting until one of them tripped and was shot in the face while lying on the ground. This is what Hollywood erased. The panic, the incompetence, the randomness of who lived and who died. Here's what they didn't teach you in school. Most men who were shot in the Old West didn't die from the bullet. They died from what came after: infection, gangrene, shock, blood loss. A man shot in the arm could lose the limb to infection within a week. A man shot in the abdomen faced almost certain death, not because the bullet destroyed a vital organ, but because it perforated the intestines. Stomach acid and bacteria would leak into the body cavity. The result was sepsis. The man would develop a fever, become delirious, and die in agony as his organs shut down one by one. Doctors in frontier towns, if there even was a doctor, had no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and no training in gunshot trauma. Their only tools were whiskey, a bone saw, and a hot iron to cauterize wounds. Survival depended on luck, and most men didn't have it. But there's something even darker that Hollywood never shows. Many men who were shot didn't die from their injuries. They died from mercy killings. Court records from the 1870s describe multiple cases where wounded men, screaming in pain with no hope of survival, were shot again by friends or bystanders to end their suffering. This wasn't murder in the legal sense. It was considered an act of compassion, but it reveals just how brutal and hopeless frontier medicine really was. And then there's the psychological aftermath. The men who survived shootouts, who killed other men face to face, were never the same. Letters and diaries from the period describe crippling guilt, nightmares, alcoholism, and suicide. Wyatt Earp, one of the most famous lawmen in the West, spent the last decades of his life trying to control his own legend because he couldn't reconcile what he'd actually done with what people wanted to believe. This is the part of frontier violence that was systematically hidden: the screaming, the begging, the slow dying, the psychological destruction of the men who lived. Hollywood sold you heroes. History left behind broken men and unmarked graves. Let's talk about what happened to the men who survived. Tom Horn, a hired gun and range detective, killed at least 17 men during his career. He was calm, efficient, and methodical. But by the time he was hanged in 1903, witnesses said he was a shell of a man. He barely spoke. He drank constantly. He had nightmares so severe that he stopped sleeping indoors. John Wesley Hardin, a gunfighter who claimed to have killed 42 men, spent 16 years in prison. When he was released, he tried to practice law, but he was paranoid, violent, and consumed by his own reputation. He was shot in the back in a saloon in 1895. He died instantly. The man who killed him was never charged. These weren't men who won their gunfights. They were men who survived just long enough to be destroyed by what they'd done. And the families left behind? They were erased. Women widowed by frontier violence had no legal recourse, no financial support, and no future. Children orphaned by shootouts ended up in workhouses, orphanages, or dead from neglect within a year. The violence didn't stop when the shooting stopped. It rippled outward and destroyed entire families. Even in the most famous gunfight in American history, the shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, 1881, the aftermath was chaos. 3 men were killed in 30 seconds of gunfire, but the real consequences took years to unfold. Wyatt Earp's brother was crippled. Another brother was murdered in retaliation. The Earp family spent the next decade in legal battles, exile, and paranoia. Wyatt himself became a fugitive and lived the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. This is what Hollywood never shows: the cost, the years of fear, the fact that even if you survived the bullet, you didn't survive the weight of what came after. So why did Hollywood lie to you? Because the truth wasn't sellable. The truth was that violence in the Old West was random, terrifying, and pointless. There were no heroes, no codes, no honor, just desperate men with guns, killing each other in the mud and dying slowly while no one could help them. The mythology of the West was built deliberately by writers who needed villains and heroes, by filmmakers who needed clean stories, by a culture that wanted to believe that violence could be noble, controlled, and meaningful. But the men who actually lived it knew better. They left behind letters, trial transcripts, and newspaper accounts that all say the same thing. It was worse than you can imagine, and nothing about it was glorious. The gunfights you've seen in movies are fantasy. The real ones were short, brutal, and left broken men bleeding out in the dirt, begging for help that never came. That's the history they didn't teach you. That's the West that actually existed. And now you know.